video expands on the status of peasants in Chaucer's England. According to the traditional medieval English view of society, known as the Three Estates, the members of the first and second estates both occupy a position of power and authority. While the first estate consisted of religious rulers, that is, members of the Christian clergy, the second was made up of secular rulers, that is, members of the aristocracy. The peasants, in contrast, were the ruled. Their subjugation was authorized by the kind of thinking represented by these binaries. Thanks to their association with the body and animals, peasants, it was thought, lacked the full humanity of, for example, the aristocracy. However, in 1381, during Chaucer's life, peasants dramatically rebelled against their servile status. The story behind that rebellion begins years earlier, in 1348, when the Black Death, or the Plague, reached England. The Black Death caused a lot of mortality. So many people died, in fact, that a peasant labor shortage occurred. All of a sudden, the peasants who survived the plague enjoyed a kind of power. Their labor was in demand more than ever before. Thanks to the labor shortage, many peasants began to demand more privileges and better pay. Those in power, however, the members of the first and second estates, resisted these changes. For example, in 1351, the king at the time, Edward III, issued a statute of laborers that rolled peasant wages back to pre-plague rates. In the years that followed, the peasants received more setbacks, especially a series of taxes issued by the crown, that is, by the king. Finally, when they had had enough, peasants gathered from throughout England, entered London, and violently resisted their servitude. Eventually, the rebellion was put down. It hardly led to a revolution. But before that happened, the peasants did do many things. They burned many key buildings. They scared the king, who was Richard II, so much that Richard hid himself in the Tower of London. And the rebels executed several key leaders, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury. How were these acts recorded and remembered? In Chaucer's England, the prime recorders of historical events were monks who wrote histories of England in Latin. One such monk was named Thomas Walsingham. I'm going to give you two short passages from Walsingham's chronicle. At this point in his account of the rebellion, Walsingham is describing the execution of Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Walsingham describes how the rebels seize Sudbury and then claims that words could not be heard among their horrible shrieks, but rather their throats sounded with the bleating of sheep. In this passage, Walsingham reinforces negative stereotypes about peasants not being fully human. First of all, he likens them to animals, and of all animals, he likens them to sheep. We might think of all the associations that sheep in particular have here. Then as now, they have associations with submissiveness, which is in keeping with the idea that peasants are not rulers, but are ruled. Moreover, Walsingham portrays the peasants as incapable of speech, and thus subhuman. Speech is a primary trait that separates the human from the non-human. But instead of words coming out of their mouths, horrible shrieks and a sheep-like bleating emerge from the mouths of peasants. Walsingham goes on to expand on this negative image of the peasants, writing that the sounds they made were like the devilish voices of peacocks. So the peasants are compared to not one but two animals, the second of which are notorious for the horrible sound they make. Here's the sound of a crying peacock. Walsingham also brings up the devil, a detail I encourage you to mull over and unpack. I've provided you with these excerpts from Walsingham's Chronicle to demonstrate the official view of peasants in Chaucer's England. By likening the peasants to sheep and peacocks, and by evacuating them of any capacity for articulate speech, Walsingham indicates just how wrong their rebellion was, how their affinity with animals makes them natural subordinates, or to put it another way, Walsingham suggests how the peasants' inherent animality necessitates their governance by clerical and aristocratic leaders. But the thing is, Walsingham's account does not accurately reflect the actual identity of the peasants. Far from quasi-animals who are incapable of using language, the peasants were highly articulate. Their rejection of the status quo was deeply thought out and very intelligent. Indeed, texts and language were a key component of the rebellion. For example, the peasants wrote poetry. Here is a famous couplet linked with the rebel leader John Ball. When Adam delved and Eve spun, who was then a gentleman? Gentleman in this couplet refers to the second estate, the aristocracy. Medieval aristocrats loved to generate elaborate genealogies that claimed that their family went all the way back to personages in the Old Testament. They did this because in medieval Europe, identities gained authority by claiming to have ancient roots. The couplet, however, points out that if we go back to the beginning of human history, as understood through a Judeo-Christian lens, there were no aristocrats. Instead, the first humans were peasants. They delved, that is dug, and spun, that is wove garments. The couplet disses aristocrats by exposing their relative newness. John Ball's couplet reflects the overall strategy employed by the rebels. The rebels took qualities associated with the peasantry, here in this case working the field, weaving animal fiber, inhabiting an agrarian world, and transformed those qualities from a negative to a positive. The rebels used peasant traits to imbue peasants with authority, power, and agency. As you revisit the miller's portrait, read his prologue and tale, please ask yourself if Chaucer's miller engages in a similar strategy. That is, how does the miller take characteristics associated with his peasant world, characteristics that his culture denigrates or puts down, and celebrate them instead?